All right, so as I was saying, or just to repeat, so if you go onto Canvas, you'll see an announcement, and you also see in the gradebook that due to the special sort of circumstances this semester, in me trying to get ahead of both scaling the class up to the size it is and then dealing with all of the online for transition due to the COVID accommodations, I am just going to get rid of the midterm that I originally didn't have in this class and added it to try to give another formative and summative assessment. So I'm just giving everyone full credit on the midterm in the grade book. And so the alternative was to just drop it. And I just wanted to try to keep the percentages and how they weight on the scores as close to the syllabus as I could. And so I'm just went through and created a midterm column and then just everybody a default grade to the top of that. And then the at home, the effort that I put into creating the parts of the midterm right now, I'm just going to keep expanding it so that we'll have that at home view as a kind of a take home open notes final exam, and for a 3:05 Monday, Wednesday class, the final exam is something like, I don't know, it's like 2:30 on a Friday of finals week. And so basically I'm gonna have the final exam due Friday of that finals week. So I haven't exactly figured what time on that day, if I'll give you the whole day. I need to see how many manually graded questions I put on that to give myself enough time to grade them before the Monday when grades are due. But because you would normally take it in class on that Friday, then that's, it won't be due any sooner than the Friday of that finals week. And so the final exam isn't released yet, and so I probably won't give it to you super early, but hopefully you'll have, say, all of finals week to be able to decide when you're going to work on it. So the goal is not for, if I can get it out earlier, that'd be great. But the goal is to just have you being able to sort of pick, arrange your time accordingly during finals week to complete the exam. It turns out none of your courses are allowed to use RP now, but they can use Lockdown Browser. But I don't plan to use Lockdown Browser for this one. It's because I'm kind of viewing it as an open notes exam. So instead, I currently have it set so that you're going to get 110 minutes and you have to complete it in that 110 minutes, but it's just going to be open to use whatever resources, and you'll kind of go on an honor code that you're working on it on your own. I might adjust that so that maybe you're not stuck to that 110-minute window, but I kind of like the idea for the final exam to have that 110-minute window. But what I am going to do my best at is to release more of these formative assessments, these like homework assignments that are these online assignments like I've been putting at the end of every unit. I've got several of them that are unfinished that I like to get out. And then some of those are droppable, and then those could hopefully be kind of prep for that. And if there's time, then we can even maybe spend a lecture period going over some old concepts and just making sure that everybody remembers what a genetic algorithm is and those sorts of things. So the situation is evolving, but that's at least the plan, is that you don't have to worry about the midterm right now, and I'm going to focus my efforts on creating helpful homework assignments and a nice summative final exam. But I should emphasize that my goal in this class was to get you to a point where you got to explore something new with the final project. So my goal in this class is not to give you a headache of the final exam. So I don't want to distract you from your final projects. And so mainly the exams are there just to ensure that people are keeping track of the material, but these are going to be relatively lightweight exams and very concept kind of heavy exams, not very mathy or something like that. The first week of May, I believe, is finals week. I think the last day of finals week might be the 8th, I think. I'd have to look for sure, but yeah, that's, I think the last week of April, I'm pretty sure is the last week of classes. Okay, yeah. All right. So that's the update. Take home, open notes, final exam, we'll say 10 minutes. And although in some of the other classes I'm using, I'll do lockdown. In this one, no plan to use lockdown. Honors code, individual efforts, and then in general, my priority is your success on final project. All right, so that's the administrative stuff. So any questions about that? And then I'll also add this homework assignments and possible review lecture may aid in exam prep. No, it's supposed to be prepped. Okay. All right. So it's not meant to cause you any additional anxiety. This is supposed to, I'm trying to reduce the anxiety and get you excited about finishing up the final projects. You just need to put something in there because we covered a lot of material, and your final projects are necessarily separate from the material because I want you to do something new, but I also want to make sure that people are at least keeping track of some of the topics that we're surveying here and making use of them. So I will do my best not to throw you any curveballs, just trying to give you a little bit of extra motivation to sort of retain some of this stuff from all these lectures. All right, well, let's then get back to these associative learning or Hebbian learning, and then spiking neural networks and neuromorphics, which is the kind of main focus for today, as we then transition to something a little more general, interacting particle systems and cellular automata, possibly at the end of this lecture and certainly starting with the next lecture. And I should mention, in case I forget to mention it later, is that when we get into cellular automata, one of the sort of well-known names in cellular automata was John Conway, who was, some of you may be familiar with Conway's Game of Life. And if not, we'll talk about the Game of Life when we get into it. But for those of you who are familiar with who John Conway is, he actually just died on April 11th. Actually related to complications due to COVID-19. So, and so I just wanted to put that out there because we will be talking about CAs, and just wanted to sort of give a tip of the hat to John Conway. I never talked to John Conway directly. I did sit in a lecture of his, and he was a very unique guy. He was a sort of a big personality, and he had an interesting way of thinking about math and its utility. And the interesting thing is, although he's well known for this Game of Life, he actually did not view it as a model for life, and he got frustrated with people in trying to take insights from the Game of Life to make, to look at life himself. So he's maybe a more practical guy than you might think, very outspoken guy. And it's very sad to hear that we've lost this personality from kind of the computer science and mathematical community. So it just happens to be a coincidence that sort of just happened now, just before we go into CAs. And so, in case I forget to mention it later, I just wanted to put that out there as a tribute to somebody who's about to come up in this topic. Probably not today, but Monday. There was a question: will I add any assignments on neural networks. That certainly isn't the plan. We've covered a lot of this neural network stuff, and so I mind at least putting a couple of things out there. This course is not supposed to be like a deep learning course, but I'm hoping that coming out of this, you understand what deep learning is. So you may not need to, coming out of this course, I'm not expecting you to know sort of all of the popular convolutional neural network architectures that are successful out there, but to kind of know roughly how the convolutional neural network is a regularization of a feed-forward multi-layer perceptron, things like that. So yeah, so I'll probably and I don't plan, no more programming assignments. Your guys' main programming focus should be your final project. Any other assignments that I threw out there are meant to just be conceptual, meant to be similar to the other homework assignments at the end of the units, meant to just sort of help reinforce and have you go back and revisit some of the other material and just see how well you remembered it and help reinforce the things you didn't remember that I think are important, almost to emphasize the things that I think are important. So, okay, so let's move on here with the spiking neural networks. So last time we left off with, so we talked about how Hebbian learning which is related to spike timing dependent plasticity, is that these, or STDP, these are viewed as a conceptual model to think about how neurons, how spiking neurons, real neurons, end up adjusting their synaptic weights based on their kind of real-time experience with the world. And so this, is that neurons wire together if they fire together. And so this is the kind of spiking version, which basically means that, so we have these terms, a presynaptic neuron, which is just the kind of upstream neuron. And then we have a postsynaptic, this is downstream, and they are connected by a synapse, S-Y-N, and then we can view that synapse as having a weight, WWIJ. And so if you were to view, I as one neuron synapsing with J, and at J you have this weight WIJ, which you can view as like the weight applied to I on J, then you can think of this as saying that if I, and so this, and I'll say the state of these two neurons, I'll call X sub I and X sub J at time t. And you can say if neuron I fires just before neuron J, then WIJ increases, which makes it more likely that if neuron I fires, it will then actually cause neuron J to fire more quickly. So it brings these close together. But then on the flip side of that, if J fires, I guess I could say just, but I could say before neuron I, then that weight WIJ decreases. And again, this is sort of the spiking version of Hebbian learning. And then the thought is then that that if you if J ends up needing to fire, because remember J has got a lot of other inputs coming into it, and so does I. And so if J happens to fire and I doesn't fire, or I fires later than J, then the thought is that the influence of I on J maybe needs to be weakened, because they don't, there's not sort of a downstream influence, and so they can kind of reduce that weight, and so you can then decrease that that weight. But if it's the other way around, where there's a tight correlation where I fires and then J fires, then you just short circuit that, and you say, okay, well then in that case, maybe when I fires, that's good evidence that J should be firing. So then you get an increase in these things. So this is, you know, the basics of kind of Hebbian learning. And so there's a question about classical conditioning. So there's some really interesting, it's kind of a side discussion, is that there's classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and these have to do with like, so, you know, classical conditioning is like Pavlov's dog, where you ring a bell. If a dog hears a bell is rung, and a dog is also given a rewarding scent, so the scent of some food, and that scent ends up causing the dog's mouth to water. If the bell is always associated with that rewarding odor, then eventually you can remove the rewarding odor, and then you end up getting an association with the mouth watering to the bell being rung. And so, yes, you can think of associative learning as a proximate mechanism underlying so-called classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is this idea where you make these associations automatically. There's another type of conditioning called operant conditioning, where you can actually train an animal that something that was unrewarded becomes rewarded. And so there's these two kind of conditionings, and you can apply these mechanisms of learning to sort of thinking about both of those. But I guess I would agree that this idea, if you remember from your Psychology 101 courses, if you took that as an elective, or maybe if you're a psych major or something like that, then yes, then you can view Hebbian learning as being very easily connected to so-called classical conditioning. But I don't want to go down that path, but I'm just mentioning it there, that yes, there are definitely connections there. All right, but then you could say, well, what about for a normal, you know, ANN? So not a spiking neural network, but our normal ANN. Well, then we can come up with something that kind of looks like a gradient approach. And so you can say that the weight of IJ at time t+1 is going to be equal to the previous weight at time t plus, let's say, some learning rate times the state of I times the state of j at time t, where you can view xi and xj as both coming from -1 or 1. And so here, then we see that those that fire together mean that those that happen to be in the same state together get tighter connections to each other, and those that happen to be in opposite states get weaker connections to it. So this is the ANN version of Hebbian learning. And so by the end of the lecture, then we will be in full spiking mode. But you can kind of see that right now I'm using the kind of physiological spiking definition to motivate this thing here, which really has nothing to do with what's going on in biology, but it's just trying to mimic this idea of Hebbian learning. And so the cool thing about that is then you get this kind of like automatic pattern recognition. And if you like to think, pattern recognition could be a type of clustering, where you want the neural network to automatically label patterns with clusters. And so it needs to sort of recognize that certain things are always associated with each other. And then those associations get labeled internally to the neural network. Now, on the output of the neural network, you know, it's an unsupervised process. So we as humans, it may not be a human readable output, but we might notice that if we have a coarser grained output than input, that we effectively get an encoding of all of the patterns that we put in. So we can put an image in and we put a bunch of different images in, but maybe our neural network only has an 8-bit output. Then we start noticing that of the millions of images we get put in, we end up only seeing 4 or 5 different 8-bit codes coming out on the output. And so that effectively our neural network has, without any input from us, has ended up finding these 4 or 5 different patterns and effectively naming them inside the neural network. And then we just need to kind of learn the names that it uses. And we use, we kind of use the consistent labels on the output. So I gave this simple example last time where you could give a neural network an image that was, a bunch of pixels. And you've got a bunch of other, images you give it. And basically, if your 2 images most of the time have sort of a stereotyped pattern in them. So, in this case, I might have this thing that kind of looks like a U, where these are the pixels that are turned on, and this other thing that maybe kind of looks like an A. And it might be that these are noisy. So sometimes you get some additional noise in these other pixels. But you do happen to notice that regardless of what the noise is, you get these consistent, strong associations, and the sort of the strong parts that are always there. You get, that the U is a frequent pattern, that these 5 pixels are frequently turned on, and the A, then you find out that these 8 pixels are frequently turned on together. And so if you're running these in as inputs to one of these ANN with Hebbian learning, then if your output might be even just a few, maybe it's just 4 neurons on the output, then over time, then what you may end up seeing is that whenever you give it a pattern that looks like the top one, even if it's a slight variant of that pattern, then you might end up seeing an output that looks, let's say, like this. We don't know what the pattern would be, but it might be that one. But when you give it this bottom one, even though they share some pixels that are turned on, then from this bottom one, then you notice that whenever I give it something that looks roughly like that bottom one, then it gives me a different pattern on the output. So instead of seeing those 2 outputs are asserted, then maybe only this one output is asserted. And so even though I'm showing it millions of images, I might only see a few patterns, like 2 patterns showing up on the output. So effectively, this Hebbian learning has recognized patterns and clustered the patterns together and provided me identities of each cluster, all through this this updating routine that can just run in real time. And so if you then get rid of all the inputs and then you start providing it different inputs, it will then reconfigure itself and it will come up with new patterns. And so it's constantly looking for new patterns. Just like the dog ringing the bell, eventually, if you start ringing the bell for things that are not related to a rewarding odor, then that dog might then forget that there is this association between the bell and the rewarding odor, and then it'll break that up and it'll stop salivating. So if you were to think of this in terms of a brain, if you were to think, then these could be then tied to actions, in which case this might encode the action for, dog, salivating, or I'll say dog drool on hearing bell. And this other action might be, dog bark on seeing uh, postal worker. And so initially, it learns that there are these two stimuli that one would call it cause it to drool, the other one causes it to bark. But if the dog's experience with the world changes, then maybe it stops drooling when it sees certain things and it stops barking. But it's kind of like constantly learning, and that's this Hebbian learning is sort of this kind of like online real-time learning. And in reality, you can actually switch from phases. You can say we're going to have a Hebbian phase, and then we're going to switch off, and we're going to let things run and not update. So that's one thing you can do. And when we get to spiking neural networks, I'll even mention work on how you actually can get neural networks to sleep. And so you can actually force spiking neural networks to go to sleep, and it actually does memory consolidation and things like that, just like sleep supposedly does for us. And then so there's some questions here as this is as good as dimensionality reduction. We're using a few so this particular application, I made the output smaller than the input space. And so yes, this is like an associative learning version of dimensionality reduction. But you know, you could also imagine having an output layer that's much bigger than the input layer, and sort of similar to thinking about in that honeybee or that stingless bee brain that I was talking about a couple lectures ago, where that mushroom body actually had more Kenyan cells than it did these olfactory glomeruli. And so even though the code for the odor was in the space of like 20 bits, then the code for how it's represented before it goes out to motor actuation was like 200 bits. And so, so we don't necessarily, it doesn't have to be dimensionality reduction. This is just another way to do training. All right. So I'll just mention this is online, let's say real time. All right, so that's where we took off, or that's where we were last time. So any other questions about this general idea of Hebbian learning before we then now talk about things related to spiking and architectures that allow this type of approach to work with spiking neural networks? Okay. All right. All right. So, so basically the kind of okay, can I reiterate what the difference between Hebbian learning and backpropagation? Is a question in the chat. Good question. So this update rule down here has this kind of learning rate which certainly seems like it relates to gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent. There's a little bit of noise, but this term over here is not any sort of gradient. And so in backpropagation, we have a loss function, and we take the derivative of the loss function, the gradient of that loss function, and that generates so an error term that allows us to then propagate backwards according to these rules that have to do with the chain rule. And so, we generated the update rule for the weights based on the chain rule, based on taking a derivative, taking a gradient. This that I'm showing you down here is not generated by taking a gradient or anything like that. It's a heuristic that is meant to implement Hebbian learning. So it's meant to implement, this basic idea that neurons wire together if they fire together. And so it doesn't come out of the math. It just comes out of how are we going to build something that does this. And it's kind of not surprising that people who have been using gradient descent to train neural networks would come up with something that kind of looks like gradient descent to train. So this is like was marketed as a way to say, take your gradient descent, but instead of using the gradient to decide the update direction, then let's use the coincidence of two different neurons to decide the updating direction. And that's the kind of module they put in here. Pop out the gradient and put in a kind of coincidence detector. So any other questions about this? Okay. The xi and xj, they come from up here. So xi and xj are the output state, and I could say at time t, output state of neurons I and j at time t. Maybe I'll put that in a little box just to separate it. The values that they store, I was saying they, xi and xj, you can view them as being activation functions with, this is the kind of range of the activation functions. And so the activation function is going to be either -1 or 1. So don't view it as a probability. It's just, I mean, these are just neurons. These are just your standard neurons, which take weighted inputs. They add up all the inputs, and then they threshold them. And then if it's above the threshold, they take a 1. And if it's below the threshold, they take a -1. And so, so that's, you can just view these as two-state neurons who map their input, which is a continuous value, to their output, which is one of two values. And in this case, it's convenient to view them as 1 or -1. There's no semantics to it. There's no meaning to this 1 or -1. If you like to view it, the neuron is either on, it's fired, or it's off, it's not fired. So 1 is on and -1 is off. I see another question here. So is this better for situations which need associations? Well, I mean, there's just different times that there's different times where you, like, we've shown some examples where you do supervised learning when you, like, I need to learn a function, and there's certain times when I do unsupervised learning when I need to do, you know, clustering, but I have a big data set that I want to cluster, and then there's reinforcement learning where I need to kind of learn something based on rewards. And so what associative learning is that we don't have a reward. We just need to find out when things happen together. And it turns out that a lot of what we view learning in, like, in biological systems or psychology, is just learning associations, is finding patterns. And so finding patterns is somehow related to clustering. But it just turns out that if we need to find patterns in a real-time kind of way, reinforcement learning isn't quite right, because we don't have that cue function. You know, we don't have that reward. So how do we find patterns online? And this provides a mechanism that is really good at over time figuring out that there's a pattern that occurs, and then locking onto that pattern and then representing it, and then losing it if that pattern goes away. And so there's a bunch of questions here. Somebody asked about another activation function that's a rectified linear unit, this RELU, and I mean, that's kind of getting into more of like a machine learning class. But you know, for those that are not familiar with RELU, it's kind of an activation function that is rectified, so it gets rid of the negative side. I'm not sort of focusing, and there's reasons why rectified linear units end up making back propagation more effective when you're doing training. And I'm not getting into all of those microscopic details. Don't worry about that. Like, all I'm saying is that you could probably come up with mechanisms that would have less aggressive activations that work the same way. I'm just saying, for simplicity, let's just consider a heavy-side activation function that, instead of taking 0 and 1, so it's like a step function. So this is basically just step function activation. And so where I've just shifted it down, so instead of going from 0 to 1, it goes from -1 to 1. So just a heavy side step function that has just been scaled and shifted. So it goes from -1 to 1. And I'm just doing that to make it seem like a neuron firing or being quiescent. And so if it's just resting, it's at -1, and if it fires, it's at 1. So those two that fire together are going to both be at 1, and those two are kind of resting together are going to both be at -1. But certainly you could generalize this Hebbian update rule to take on continuous outputs as well, in which case you could view these as if this is positive, if this is very positive, and this is also very positive, then their weight is going to increase. But if this is only like close to 0 and this is very positive, then maybe it won't increase as much. But if this is positive and this is negative, then this is going to decrease. So you could definitely generalize this to continuous activation functions. But for simplicity, in this example, I'm just sticking with a nonlinear one that switches between two states. So I think based on the kind of interleaving of questions I'm seeing here, one that maybe if I fires before J, then the value of, okay, so the fires before, that is in the kind of spiking version. This down here, in this bottom half of the page, or bottom fifth of the page, represents the artificial neural network approximation of the spiking rule. So the spiking rule, so we're instead of saying if I fires just before J, the version of that in this thing is basically if on the last time step, if I and J agree. So so this is kind of the, I could view this as is up here. This is like the analog version, and this is kind of like the digital version. Or this is the asynchronous version, and this is the synchronous version. And so in the asynchronous version, if you fire just before the other one fires, then the weight increases. In the synchronous version, if on the last clock, if you agree, then you increase the weight. So that's kind of the difference here. So it's just an approximation. So any other questions about that? This is just the kind of intro to Hebbian learning for neural networks. Certainly could get much more complicated. All right, but just kind of bridging the subject here, or breaching the subject here. So neural networks have kind of moved through, so initially you had artificial neural networks, had, Boolean activation functions. And this is kind of the first generation of neural networks. And then they got continuous activation functions. And so basically up here, the Boolean ones, you could view that as kind of for classifier type problems. And then then these continuous activation functions allowed for kind of regression type problems. But these here were really focused on the network and not the device. So the properties of the neuron were ignored. And so now we're moving into a new era. Well, it's not that new. So there has been there's a field, Carver-Mead, I think, is the big one associated with this field of neuromorphics. So this term neuromorphic is embracing the idea that the morphology and dynamics of the biological neuron matter? And so the network matters, but also exactly how the neuron works. And so this is very asynchronous. It's very much more analog. Um, and so there are now, and we can talk more about these here, I think, in a bit, but um, there, so starting with, there were a bunch of people that started working with neuromorphic circuits back in the late 70s and 80s, people doing computer vision with neural networks that they kind of built that were, as these rigs were like as big as a desk, but then they ended up having like artificial retinas and things like that. They worked like a real eyeball, and they could actually perceive shapes and flow and all sorts of things like that using these kind of spiking architectures. Things started to get a little bit more serious in smaller scale with projects like, there's a framework called SpiNNaker, which notice the S in N was, a hardware implementation of spiking neural networks. And we'll get into what we mean by that here in a second. And then since then, bigger groups have gotten involved, like IBM. Some of you might be familiar with their TrueNorth processor, and a little more recently, Intel and their Loihi processor. And so these are when you're getting into higher levels of integration. So you're still at the levels of, I don't know, like say 1,000, neurons or so. But they are approaching sizes and scales where they are small, fast, and very low power. And so the idea is you could possibly deploy some of these hardware things on the fly in very, so people worry about size, weight, and power. Size, weight, and power. So I guess I could say and. So for low size, weight, and power applications, then people are interested in thinking about how spiking neural networks can actually end up providing all of the benefits, or many of the benefits, of artificial neural networks, but in a much, much smaller form factor that uses a lot less power. And so that's this, like Loihi is extremely low weight in terms of, well, I guess it's low power, so has a lot of benefits there. And as people are moving more and more into this, then actually not that long ago, maybe like a year ago, then things like back propagation now exists for these architectures for spiking neural networks. And so it's even becoming possible to train neural networks using exactly the same tools, train spiking neural networks using exactly the same tools as you use for artificial neural networks. And so they're becoming much, much more practical. And so it's kind of, getting, I guess, a little bit ahead of that. So let's see what, let's review what we mean by spiking. And so the idea here is that, like in a basic model of a neuron, you have this kind of, there is a resting potential, and you can view this, let's say in, well, if it helps, you can think of this in the dendrite of the neuron. It's sitting there and it's resting at a particular voltage, a particular potential. And then you receive some stimulus. And so this here is a stimulus that brings the neuron well above a critical, so it brings it above a threshold called the action potential. And so once you bring a neuron over this action potential, it starts a process not unlike the way a camera shutter works, where the neuron is then activated and it brings its own potential very high and then very low, and then it comes back to rest. And so this ends up generating a so-called spike. And that spike ends up generating a stimulus to nearby parts of the neuron, in the case of a spike traveling down an axon or nearby neurons. And so if you have this neuron here, then you've got the kind of cell body that is over here, and you've got this long axon, and there's some other neuron that terminated on this, there's this dendrite, and then someone else's axon. And so there is a synapse between these two. And so basically, so there was a question, spike is a stimulus or spike, or the stimulus creates the spike? My answer to that question is yes, they're both of them. So you're going to have a spike travels down the presynaptic neuron, and it then generates a stimulus to the postsynaptic neuron, which in this case is this one here. And then that creates a stimulus that then causes a pulse to be sent down the axon. And internally, down the axon, we view that pulse as triggering the next pulse. And so it's kind of like, it's like water going down an ice cube tray, is that the water keeps filling and then unfilling and all that. And so then that you watch the pulse kind of go down the axon until eventually it then is going to potentially interface with other neurons along the axon, and that will generate stimulus for those other neurons down those axons. And so the stimulus can be generated internally as well as externally, but we view them as spikes that are traveling down these things. And this underneath here, this here is a so-called refractory period, where basically the neuron is not responsive to new spikes. And so these dynamics, the shape of this curve, ends up limiting how quickly spikes can come after each other. And so the information in neurons ends up being communicated by the frequency of these spikes, and that frequency kind of has a limit where things are always going to have a little bit of a gap in between them. So they can have a huge gap in between them, but then they're ultimately, spikes are going to always kind of have space in there. So neurons are never continuously on. They're either spiking super, super frequently, or they're spiking very infrequently. And information is carried in the frequency of those spikes. So there's a question, so what is the spike? So a spike is, if it helps, this here you could view as voltage or potential. And so there is a buildup in potential. You can view that as charge. And so You can say that like when something touches your finger, there are processes that end up generating a spike of a voltage spike. And that voltage spike is what starts a process that is going to lead trigger these spikes to then translate from your sensory neurons to your interneurons, and those that will end up landing in your brain and bouncing all around each other. And so the spike that gets innervated at the tips of your fingers ends up generating a voltage spike that ends up generating new voltage spikes, and all these cascades end up causing this thing to translate, you know, ultimately maybe to your, as a reflex or up to your brain. And so that's what the spikes are, is that they're these just temporary transient voltage increases that are self-sustaining for a short period of time before they crash and go back to resting. So I don't know if that answers the questions. I see in terms of the math we've been discussing, what is the spike? In terms of so that's the, in the math, we've so far, when you build, so in the case of these frameworks here, then what you end up doing is there are a number of different differential equation models of spiking. So like the Hodgkin-Huxley, for example, there's integrate and fire. And then there are many more. And so when you configure IBM TrueNorth, or when you go in and download code to Intel Loihi, what you actually specify is what type of spiking dynamic you want on your neurons. So you basically say, these are the neurons I want, these are where I want the synapses to be, and I want each individual neuron to simulate this differential equation. So we're bringing kind of this ordinary differential equation stuff back from calculus. So, and I guess I should label this as time. So you specify an ODE model of your neuron to be emulated in parallel on the spiking neural network hardware or software if you're simulating. And then the interactions between the dynamical models carry out computations. And like, you know, you could say like pattern recognition. So I could specify this, and then you could say, you know, and specify spike time dependent plasticity. So, you know, you could also, not only are you specifying that the neurons act this way, but you can also specify that the way in which these neurons are coupled together. So you can imagine a spike. You could say this neuron is next to this neuron, and I am going to say that I'm going to simulate the fact that them being very close together and one neuron being very sensitive to another, which means when I get a spike in one neuron, I am going to then simulate a stimulus of a particular height in the other neuron. And only when I get enough stimuli that come together to create a large enough spike am I going to cross the action potential of that neuron to cause it to spike as well. And you can make those weights, how sensitive one neuron is to another, update using spike timing dependent plasticity. And so if you implement spike timing dependent plasticity and a dynamical model of spiking on like an Intel Loihi chip, then you can have Loihi, if you've got an input that has been encoded into spikes, like of a pattern from an image, start to do that image, that pattern finding that I talked about in that previous example. So things get a little more analog here, is that we actually have to then pick out an analog model, and there are several kind of standard models, and then have it implemented, and then the computation is happening actually in these spiking pulses. So it's not just how they're connected, but it's also how things are spiking. How long is this refractory period? You know, that is going to limit how quickly things can recover. You know, what are the action potentials? Like, how much of a stimulus do you need? These are all parameters that can go in. So you can now adjust every neuron to make them a little bit different, and you get different computational patterns across the network. So that's the basic idea behind this spiking. And so you can say, well, how do I get information into this? And I kind of have already sort of mentioned this, is that information is coded in spike trains. And so you could have you know, very active neurons might have a bunch of spikes arriving very close to each other. And maybe there's more periods where they arrive close to each other, but then gaps in between. But then you can also have less active neurons where you see a spike, only periodic spikes. And you can view this is encoding like a 1, and maybe, you know, this is encoding like a 0, and something in between is encoding something between 0 and 1. That's one way to kind of view this encoding. And so what we're doing here is we are trading space for time. So before, if I wanted to have an internal representation of a signal that had an 8-bit depth, so the signal could be one of 256. So 2 to the 8th is 256, and so if I wanted the signal to be you know, anywhere from 0 to 255, then inside my artificial neural network, I somehow need to have 8 bits in there so that I could potentially represent all 256 levels. Well, in this case, we don't worry as much about the number of neurons, but we worry about how many spikes we can pack into time. And so that refractory period is kind of like a quantization error, because that refractory period prevents the spikes from getting very, very close together. And so you could say that, like, if spike trains can have very high frequency, they encode a large bit depth for every single neuron. So even though the neuron, technically you might view it as being on or off, in spiking neural networks, we can't think of things as being on or off anymore. We have to think of them in terms of their duty cycle. So we have to think of them across time. So the information is not, are you on or off? The information is stored in how frequently are you on, what is the ratio of on versus off? That's where the information is stored. All right, so I see a couple of questions here. Am I trying to say that some neurons will not send out signals at some times? Yes, so when the neurons are, so if I draw my action potential, then whenever things are resting, you can view that neuron as being, off or not sending any signals. And so neurons only stimulate other neurons when they're in this action, when they're going through. Um, so I'd say when they are spiking. So if I view my action potential is down here, and then this is my spike, then if a neuron is not spiking, it is not communicating. And so you can view the neuron as sort of being off. And then it turns on, but it can turn on frequently or it can turn on infrequently. And how frequently it turns on, it encodes the information from one neuron to the next. So you get like a rapid spike train in one neuron and it leads to a rapid spike train in the next, and so on and so forth. Now, a rapid spike train in one neuron, if it's only weakly coupled to the next neuron, might lead to an infrequent spike train in the next. So then we've seen a computation happen there, because now we've gone from having, sending a 1 into the system and getting a 0.5 out of the system. So as we change, as the spike trains move through the neural network and change their frequency representations, that is a hallmark of computation going on. So we're computing in time and space. I mean, because there are multiple neurons working simultaneously, but we now have to think about how tightly things are packed into space or into time. We don't only think about how things are packed into space. So I see, so spikes are along the time axis to save space. That is one way you can think about it. So those of you who've ever taken a signal processing course, you might have heard of sigma delta analog to digital converters, and and this is one example of this, but there's a bunch of these different, or just in general, for those of you who've maybe done robotics, you might be familiar with pulse width modulation. So I know that I maybe can't communicate to certain types of motors and analog voltage. I can only turn those motors on or off, or maybe I can only turn them forward or reverse. Well, then how do I encode speed? Well, I know that I can use pulse width modulation. And the pulse width modulation is limited by how tiny I can make those pulses. If I can make them really, really tiny, then I can get major gradations in the speed of this motor. So even though the motor locally only looks like it's either on or off, then if I back up and I look at it over longer time scales, it looks like the motor is moving slowly. And that's because it's only getting pulses of on for very infrequent amounts of time. So we are already familiar with this time-space trade-off. We just maybe don't think of it in terms of neurons as much, but we actually think that real neurons are sort of operating like pulse width modulated motors or sigma delta ADCs, where you only have 1 bit of digital information, but you use this feedback circuit to turn that bit on and off very, very, very rapidly. So in the signal processing literature, there's a bunch of things about oversampling. And the whole point in oversampling, so you might think you only need 1 sample, but you take 1,000. And the idea is if you take 1,000 samples, and then you can decide whether those 1,000 samples are up or down, then in the average from those 1,000 samples, you can encode the same information you could have got with 1 sample. With 1 sample, you might have had 16 bits to encode. With 1,000 samples, you may only need 1 bit, but you have that 1 bit over and over and over again. And then the aggregate sum of those encodes the same info. So trading space for time. And then I see, I cannot think of neurons working in time coordinates. So how do you vary this if neurons are connected? Well, so, and then this goes back to that Hebbian learning and that spike timing dependent plasticity is that, or STDP, is that the sensitivity of one neuron to another can be updated according to those spike time dependent plasticity rules that I was mentioning before, where if it sees a spike just before it spikes, then its sensitivity to that previous generator of the spike will go up. And then the next time around, then those neurons, then when that first neuron spikes, it'll be much more likely for that second neuron to spike without any other input. And so this plasticity is the learning process that goes from random connections to connections that are actually doing things like finding patterns. So to give, so basically, so right now, people have basically taken these, you can take a differential equation representation of these dynamics that generate these spikes. And so there was a question, how does gradient descent fit into spike trains? Up until about last year, there wasn't a good way for people to fit gradient descent into spike trains. But if, and I can see about posting this paper in this unit, but there was a relatively recent paper where they discovered a way in which you can update these weights in using exactly the same method as gradient descent, but using using this kind of spike train logic as opposed to a numerical logic. And so that is a new innovation that we can do back propagation with spiking neural networks now. But until before then, pretty much associative learning and STDP, spike timing dependent plasticity, that was pretty much all that you had, because people knew how to generate, they knew spike timing dependent plasticity could do cool things, and they knew that they could simulate networks of spiking neurons. And so they had to develop algorithms that could be trained with STDP. And then so again, recently they've discovered ways in which you can take insights from back propagation and train these things. And and it's kind of a combination of back propagation and STDP, but that is a very recent innovation. Okay, so let's sort of close this one, this lecture, with a simpler hardware example that kind of gives you an idea of where things are going and what this spike timing dependent plasticity can get you. And then I'll mention at the start of next time kind of the additional complexities that people are thinking about adding to neurons that go beyond this. Like, this is sort of the basics, but it turns out real neurons are even more complicated than that, and people think that these other complications are important. And so we'll sort of talk about some of those other complications before we transition into interacting particle systems. So there's a question about a topic known as dropout, which there's a question that says, wouldn't dropout simulate stochasticity of spikes? And so for those of you who have used neural networks in supervised learning applications, you might be familiar with this idea of dropout, where you sort of turn off certain random set of neurons during your training, and you kind of keep deciding which ones to turn off. And then hopefully at the end, you get a more generalized neural network. And you could probably draw analogies between, and I'm not going to get into this because this is kind of getting outside the bounds of what I wanted to talk about. I think but you probably could draw analogies between dropout, this approach in kind of traditional artificial neural networks, and spiking neural networks, but really the mechanism of operation is very different. So dropout is much more, how do I use randomness to improve generalizability of networks? Whereas the randomness is important, but that's not really what I'm focusing on here. It's about, a different mechanism for communicating information from one neuron to another. So dropout is about like training a small fraction of neurons in a particular iteration of your training, and then training another fraction of them, a different iteration, another and another and another, and then kind of building a random forest where then at the end you turn them all back on and you kind of ask them simultaneously, all of you were effectively trained in different networks. What are all your networks think together? And that's kind of different than what we're saying here, because you still train the entire network simultaneously. It's just in this like turning on and off is happening almost at a faster time scale than your training. So like in Dropout, it's almost like you're dropping neurons out at a slow time scale. In spiking neural networks, you're dropping neurons out at a really, really fast time scale. So some of you, might be kind of lost if you're not familiar with this like dropout idea, and I'm not writing anything down because, but it's like sort of for those of you that are interested in this, you might want to look up Dropout. It's a more advanced topic for neural networks. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to end on here, maybe I'll just have to start this example for next time, is there's a cool paper that if it isn't published to the Canvas site, I'll make sure that it gets published there. But this is back from 2017, where they ended up using these new electronic components called memristors that are that have hysteresis in that, and they basically end up allowing for hardware implementations of spiking neurons. And I don't mean, so like when I talk about Intel Loihi, they're kind of cheating because they're just saying we're going to take a silicon implementation of a hardware emulator of an ordinary differential equation, and you can put on your own ordinary differential equations. The physical hardware is still effectively digital, but you're simulating this analog response. A memristor is a memory resistor that basically a memristor changes its resistance based on how much current has, I'll say, has moved through it. And so it is effectively a plastic device in that it can be changed. So, the current and resistance are intrinsically linked. And so it can actually be changed by the current going through it. And that can then change how much current goes through it later. And so it's 4:20, so I'm going to stop here. But the kind of hint is that we can now build arrays of these memristors that automatically do pattern learning. So they automatically do associative learning without any simulation. So we can actually build effectively, semiconductor neurons using these memristors without, like I said, without any emulation. And it turns out that you lay these things out and you put inputs in, and if you put inputs in that have consistent patterns, they start giving you consistent outputs. And so these things learn on their own. It's like, imagining putting two resistors down on a table and then coming back later and finding out that they learned how to do your taxes. It's a lot like that. Maybe not a lot like that, but a little like that. But we'll get to that next time. I'll sort of leave that there. It's 4:21. I don't want to keep anybody else. I'll hang around here until 4:30. So if there's any questions, you can feel free to hang on here. Otherwise, if you got someplace to go, feel free to head out. Oh, there's a question. Will we have access to these lecture videos after the course ends? You should, and there's actually two ways. If you go to the Canvas site, in the course lectures module, if you go way up to the top of that module, there is a link to the blog for this course where I actually post the YouTube version of these lectures. And there's even a link where all the lectures are in correct order. So the blog is in like reverse order, but then there's a link next to it that puts them in the right order. And that's available right now, and I don't plan to take that down. And they're hosted on YouTube. So they're even hosted in a totally different place. So they should be available. All right, any other questions? And again, feel free to take off if you need to. I'm going to stop the recording here in a bit. Okay. All right. In that case, I'll see everybody next time. Sorry that we didn't get quite as far as I'd like to get today, but It was a good discussion. So have a good weekend.